More recap.
More recap. Well, welcome again to Grumpy Science. This time we're going to try to emphasize a little more science, a little less grumpy.
Never a little less grumpy.
Well, try to get the balance right. But anyway, Bob and Mark.
Yeah, I'm grumpy, he's science. So, however you want to call it. But we're still doing kind of a recap, but you may want to stay tuned because we're going to be adding something to it. And one of the things to mention is that, I'm in the middle of writing a bunch of papers, so I'm also in the middle of reading a lot of papers, something that goes along hand in hand with that. And one of the papers I was reading was talking about systems level approach, and I found that very encouraging because a lot of people are now realizing that a systems level approach is really the way to look at brain health. Not that we have anything to do with brain health, but we are doing lots of research on measuring brain function. And so basically, a lot of people are very what's called reductionist. And if you don't know what a reductionist means, that means you probably hear stuff on the news all the time where somebody's identified this secret magic molecule that causes Alzheimer's, or the secret
gene,
the secret gene,
the one gene that causes this ailment.
Yeah, it has nothing to do with environmental factors or overall cardiovascular health,
or the response of a complex system to myriad inputs.
Yeah,
that never happens.
The point that one of these authors was making was, it's really complex.
That can be used as a cop-out. That's used all the time as a cop-out. Like, oh, biology's so complex. A cell is the most complex thing a man knows about. They trail off into some sort of, reverent silence just to make the point we can't possibly understand everything about how a cell works. The point, though, is that you don't have to in order to figure out a lot of things, especially at a system level.
And they were actually talking about, different levels. And you have, one level is this kind of a molecular, very reductionist level. The next level would be like a systems level. And then a level above that is sort of experiential, things like, and other kinds of measures that you do at a cognitive level. So, for example, the measures that we make with the brain gauge are really this kind of the building blocks of learning and memory. So those systems measures like of lateral inhibition and plasticity and things like that really feed into the upper level memory orders and basically let Bob describe what error propagation is.
Oh, error propagation.
And how that fits in with reductionist models. And
put me on the spot, but yes, Professor, I'll go to the board and try to answer your question. So you want me to talk about error propagation?
I'm getting off subject, but
that's okay. So sometimes when you make a small error, and this is true in a computer, but it's also true in a complex calculation or when you're trying to model a big system, right? You can make a small error that gets multiplied as it percolates up through the system. That's
exactly
what you
right?
Yeah.
And so if you tweak your circuit, which is, think of the brain as a fractal organization, which means it's an overall organization that looks very much like the tiniest element. And you keep repeating that tiny functional element, and the functionality is actually made up the way things are connected. And those connections can be anatomical and or biochemical, basically what kind of neurotransmitters are going back and forth.
Yep.
So that makes a big difference. So anyway, I just wanted to recap what systems measures were. And then, let's give an example of, say, how would you get a systems measure on the heart?
Well, you could do like a blood pressure test. Is that what you're getting
blood pressure cuff is one.
So yeah, blood pressure cuff is one. You can do other things that are more invasive, but you can get sort of really good measures that tell you a lot about how the cardiovascular system's working. You can measure like ejection fraction for the heart. That tells you a lot about how it's working as a pump.
I was going to say heart rate. But
heart rate's another one that takes into account things outside the body, like is your cardiovascular system able to adapt to changes in demand?
Sure.
Right?
So
cardiovascular fitness.
One thing people do for a lot of their tests is they do a stress test. They
I see what
they do a heart rate and blood pressure, and then they get somebody on a treadmill or on an exercise bike, and then they do that again. So see the applications.
What Dr. Tommerdahl is getting at here is that sometimes when you want to test a system, you have to stress that system, right? If you want to
Exactly.
know how fast a car is going to go from 0 to 60, you got to floor it, right?
Right.
If you want to know what you can do something called a metabolic stress test, which they put you on a treadmill and you're chomping along as fast, at a certain rate, and they stress you more and more and more, and they check your metabolic response, and so some things, some system responses, you actually do have to kind of push the system to its limit. Is that what you're getting at, right?
I mentioned my stress test recently in the last video was how many buzzards are flying around when I go out running, and say, oh my gosh, he looks bad.
He knows his cardiovascular overall fitness is better, inversely related to the number of buzzards that are detecting his stress.
but while we're on the topic of cardiovascular health, this is something that we looked at years ago, 2006. So we started doing studies around 2004, 2005. So the science of the brain gauge has actually been evolving over a really long time in parallel with the technology development. And one of the things that we looked at, we went to a retirement home and a retirement community, not a home. So
a lot of people there, right?
Yeah, a lot of people there, and people seem to be in pretty good health, and we actually tested everyone in an exercise class after they'd exercised, and we got lots of data on them. And if you're familiar with brain gauge scores, we were looking at accuracy and plasticity in particular, and so their scores were all over the place, all over the map. So you look at it and you say, and I believe Professor Know-It-All would have had an opinion on this, and he would say, well, you have to average everything together.
You just average it out.
Yep. They're all the same age. They're all the same age, but therefore it's all the same.
Right. You average everything out, and then that gives you the answer.
Yep.
That's
and therefore people that are older are obviously much worse than people that are younger, because if you average the scores, we actually saw, well, yeah, that was. But I sort of took a little different approach, and I said, well, they all had this list of medications, and the medication list was quite long and quite extensive.
And let me just interject here. 20 years ago, I was in a study of the gerontological community up around Ann Arbor, Michigan. And once again, implicated in people falling down was the number of drugs they were taking. It's almost like a linear relationship between the number of drugs you're taking and the probability that you're going to fall down and hurt yourself.
Actually, there was another study. We were just talking about reaction time studies. That's one of the reaction time studies was people who had a higher chance of falling down had higher reaction times, high being worse. So their reaction times were much worse.
Well, it may be that both of those things are related to some fundamental driver. Remember, we were talking in an earlier talk about, ice cream sales versus violent crime. It's not that ice cream sales are driving violent crime, but both are correlated to warm, pleasant weather, right? Warmer weather, you get more ice cream sales, more people outside thugging around, causing trouble. And so what Mark is pointing out here is that where we can detect cognitive changes that are not good, people's performance is going down, you can also see that in their behavior and their tendency to maybe fall down and hurt themselves. But these things might have a more fundamental driver.
Yeah. And we might actually have to turn to our multimedia center.
So let us turn on the screen here. We'll call it up.
You might actually have to pull this up because the graph was not printed out.
Let me hit the. Let me open the window.
Click
open the window.
Okay, there we go.
There it is.
Now this is not really. Maybe I should show it.
It's even crooked. That makes it awesome.
It's kind of crooked, but
that makes it. That's real, man.
Yeah. Well, we should actually turn it 90 degrees to look like what you're used to looking at on your brain gauge scores. And basically, if you're looking at the brain gauge scores, it's a bar chart. Just look at these. What this is control. Healthy control is that first number for under 65.
So what are the scales? So this is a group of people.
This is a group of people, and this is their amplitude, their test amplitude scores. And what this means is that they were approximately 20, their DL, how well they could detect changes in contrast and accuracy was around 20%. And now look at the people in green. Well, that's the people that were over 65. but they were not on any medications. They were not on blood pressure,
so with
specifically
age,
blood pressure medications.
The longer the bar, the lower the performance, the less good. So longer bars in this graph are bad. Right?
Yeah, exactly. On this graph, longer bars are bad. Now, on this bar, these are people over 65, specifically on blood pressure medication, actually specifically beta blockers.
That's right.
So,
which are purported to not cross the blood-brain barrier.
Well, if you go back and you go through the literature,
originally, that's what
the original literature way back around 2000. Yeah, you go just read back.
Way back
you'll find papers that say beta blockers don't cross the blood-brain barrier. And actually, it turned out about this time. This was only about a year before my dad passed away. And I found out that he'd been on beta blockers for 10 years and had
cumulative effects too.
Quite an effect on his cognition. And when I brought that up to the doctor, who was about 100 years old at the time, he said, "Oh no, that's just a heart medication. It doesn't have anything to do with the brain. So it won't do anything." So
trust me, I'm a doctor.
We'll get more dislikes on this one now.
Yeah, I'm sure we will.
Yeah, I actually had a senior colleague tell me, "Don't show this data, you'll get shot." So
I've heard that 5 or 6 times. I haven't been shot yet. Maybe I've been shot at. I just haven't been hit.
Yeah, well, it might be the gun turrets on your outside your lab.
We have
keeping them away.
Security here.
But anyway, the takeaway message from that first cluster is that, well, the beta blockers apparently do cross the blood-brain barrier, and more recent literature shows that that's pretty evident, even to the point that some beta blockers are actually used to treat PTSD.
Oh, that's right. That's
and
right.
enhance selective memory.
If it didn't cross the blood-brain. So they're sort of like tacitly, okay, yeah, you're right, after 10 or 15 years, yeah.
Maybe it has a use for crossing the blood-brain barrier. But, modern researchers, post-2010,
right,
are pretty much in agreement that they do cross the blood-brain barrier. But, there's still some debate as to whether they have effect.
All right, so now
to be fair, maybe your cardiovascular health is just going downhill at the same pace that your cognition is going down. Therefore, you're on beta blockers. So, see, this is also the ice cream and violence effect. So, you sort of have to decide for yourself. And if you're taking medications, which we have nothing to do with, and you just want to test your accuracy score, that would be one place to start.
Yeah.
And actually see, does that have an effect? And not all medications actually make you worse. We actually have data, and we'll talk about it in a different talk. Some medications actually make different scores better, especially if you're deficient in certain things. Now let's look at the plasticity scores. Now we reported this a little bit differently. This was the nerdy way to do it way back when we were doing it.
Back in the day.
But the plasticity score is actually derived from looking at the difference between this black bar and this black bar. So
the bigger the difference, the better.
Right. The bigger the difference, the better.
More plasticity.
Yeah.
Just because you're seeing more of a change when they're more different, right?
Right. And so we deliver a conditioning stimulus that makes it harder to do the test. And that's only because of if the circuitry is intact, and if you have an illusion, and we're going to talk about that in a different talk. Basically, illusions are, the brain connects the dots to make an illusion.
The brain takes its signals and tries to create a model of reality, and sometimes that model is inaccurate. We call that an illusion, right?
Right, exactly. But basically, the difference between here and here looks very good.
Looking at the black bars,
and now
big difference.
Look at the green bars.
A lot of plasticity.
Big difference.
That's good.
Look at the blue bars.
Not much of a change.
Not too big of a difference.
So the blue bars are beta blockers, right?
Correct.
And the small or almost insignificant, I could say, change from one to the next shows very little neuroplasticity that we think is likely the result of beta blockers.
Correct.
Right?
Now, and I did put this data in a grant application to an aging organization.
Oh yeah.
And I got some heated remarks from the reviewer. Well, one of the remarks was this was 2007. I mean, This was ancient history. And I made the statement that I believe inflammation is one of the biggest problems in aging dementias, Alzheimer's. And the reviewer said that is preposterous. Inflammation has nothing to do with it. You look at literature now, inflammation is all of a sudden it's a big problem. Now, I don't think we've evolved in the last 10 years to where inflammation was not a problem.
I certainly haven't evolved. I still have dirty socks in the same place in my room that were there 10 years ago.
Yeah,
too much information.
I've devolved, so I won't go there.
But Mark's point is that people haven't changed. Some of it is that we've changed what we can measure, and our ability to measure biomarkers of inflammation is much better now. So we can detect things we couldn't detect before. But also, there's been a change in the way people think about the data that's been there for a long time. And really, in the last 4 or 5 years, people have come to accept that inflammation plays a tremendous role in many disease processes. I think it's virtually every disease of aging has something to do with inflammation.
Plasticity is very tightly coupled with inflammation. The higher, if you have a lot of inflammation, then your plasticity score will go down.
There you go.
So anyway,
that's
probably enough for today.
I think it is. That's one reasonable, bite of information.
If they see us again, we'll probably be wearing the same thing because these are the only shirts we own.
No, I have another T-shirt, and I'm trying to give it a big contrast. I have a blue one and a black one, so you'll know. Anyway, thanks a lot. We'll see you later.